I mean, it's well known that James Cameron, when he did Avatar, came to us to utilize our software, and pretty much any movie in the last 20 or so years that's won an Oscar for visual effects has used our software in some forms.
Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya, and I want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors who make this show not only possible but also a lot of fun. Being a sponsor of this show has its own benefits, including but not limited to appearing on the show itself. So if you want to become a sponsor, please check the details we have posted below. And now let's go ahead and enjoy the show.
So we are here at Open Source Leadership Summit, and we have with us, I mean, I have known you for so long, but we never got time to actually sit and do the interview.
Right.
So before we kind of deep dive into some hardball questions, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Guy Martin. I run the Open Autodesk office at Autodesk, and I've had an interesting career in open source. I started out basically as an engineer, spent the first half of my career writing software, everything from bank processing systems to embedded in things like Motorola phones, and then really realized kind of along that way that I was better at communicating and talking to both business and technical audiences, and I wasn't going to be the world's next great engineer. So I kind of shifted career a little bit, and I like to say now that I get to write code for fun. I get to hack on IoT stuff and smart things and things like that, and much to my partner's chagrin. But I get to write code for fun, but I actually get to work with open source communities and business and technical audiences to get them to work better together. So I'm more of a community person now than I am an engineer.
I think that's the kind of evolution when we look at anybody. Everybody starts an engineer, but in the end you end up managing and doing a lot of stuff.
Right.
And when we think about Autodesk, we think about a company where you think about movies and all this stuff. So first of all, I don't know how much you can disclose, but what are the movies, Hollywood blockbuster that are powered by Autodesk technologies?
Well, I mean, it's well known that James Cameron, when he did Avatar, came to us to utilize our software, and pretty much any movie in the last 20 or so years that's won an Oscar for visual effects has used our software in some form. So, and it's not traditionally what you think of when you think of Autodesk, right? You think of AutoCAD and
Exactly.
and BIM and Revit and manufacturing, and we do a lot of great work in those areas. But I think one of the areas that people really didn't realize where we do a lot of work is in the film and media space, and there's a lot of stuff we're doing in open source with that today that I think is really interesting.
Are you using open source, or your products are open source?
Yeah, absolutely. We, like any company, right, in today's age, you can't get away with not consuming open source. So we consume a lot of open source. I think where I've come in, and I've been at Autodesk about 3 years now, one of the reasons I was brought in was to help us with what our open source strategy was in terms of how we contribute back more effectively to open source, how we open source code within our own environment that we now want to be a standard and is non-differentiating, right? It's not strategic IP anymore. So I think that's one of the main reasons I was hired, was to help us sort out that part of our open source strategy. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of right now is the work we are doing in the film and media space. So contributing to projects like Universal Scene Descriptor, the Open Color I/O project, and really helping our film and media customers utilize both our products and other products and other companies' products through this combination of open source software that kind of lets our customers mix and match tools from different vendors, because they have a very heterogeneous environment, these film studios do when they're doing these visual effects.
Right. You mentioned Pixar. I remember when Pixar open sourced their 3D rendering, and they were running on Red Hat Enterprise Linux on the System 76 machine.
Right.
So how much of your technologies are run on Linux? How much is Linux been used in the studio? Because you have the insider information that none of us have.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah. Obviously, our products run on Linux, right? We know they run on Linux. We know they run on Mac and Windows. That's not a secret to anybody. So, I mean, we do a lot of work on Linux for those products, and our customers use those.
Linux gives a lot of flexibility over the hardware. You can make changes to the kernel level that may not be possible with Mac OS or Windows. So, is it that the film industry uses more Linux, or?
I mean, I can't speak for the film industry. I know that they do in their pipelines, right, in these visual effects pipelines to build movies. Yeah, they tend to use a lot of Linux because of the flexibility, right, because of their ability to mix and match hardware and to get the most out of that hardware. Now, obviously, rendering artists and things like that, visual effects artists, some will use Windows or Mac, so it is important that our tools kind of run on all three of those platforms. But obviously, I think it's less for us about we consume open source and we build our stuff to run on open source, but it like I said, it's these pieces where we actually can contribute to these essentially standards, right?
Exactly.
Universal Scene Descriptor, again, Material X, these projects that are really kind of the lingua franca for all of our customers to use our tools in conjunction with other vendors' tools. And I think that's kind of a maturation I know that Autodesk has seen, and I think you'll see in a lot of proprietary companies is, hey, especially in industries like film and movie and visual effects, is you're not going to buy everything from one vendor, right? So it's in our best interest to make the customer successful, and that is contributing to open source as it helps them do things like make great movies.
And then talk about all these tools that you have open sourced. Why did you decide to open source them? Because you have kind of dominance in the market.
Well, so first of all, things like Universal Scene Descriptor, Material X, those were kind of joint projects within the industry. So it's not like we, took code that we had been building internally and open sourced that. Now, we've open sourced a lot of things both in all of our sectors, right? So I think it's less about, again, it comes down to, for me, strategic IP versus non-differentiated IP. And I think and it's not unique to Autodesk. Every place that I've been, you've always had this discussion, right? And it's always, some things are really clear, right? Some things are very clear that, okay, this isn't strategic for us anymore, but if everybody uses it and becomes a standard, it actually helps our other side of the business, the proprietary side. And then some things are not quite as clear, right? Some things are kind of in the gray area. And I think that's where it gets interesting, running an open source program office. And I know all of my colleagues here at Open Source Leadership Summit that run open source program offices have this same challenge, right? Is when they talk to legal, they talk to the business folks, is sometimes things aren't clear cut as to whether this is strategic or not. I think one of the things that we've done at Autodesk that I share with a lot of my colleagues here is build up a process where when you're going to open source something, you don't just say, okay, we're going to open source this, and then you go to your legal team and have them start to review it. One of the things that I was really fortunate to be able to do when I started at Autodesk is meet with one of our chief legal counsel folks for open source, and she and I sat down and said, well, kind of where was the process a challenge? And one of the places the process was a challenge was that there was no sort of business strategy review about, does it make sense to open source this thing, right? It was one team saying, hey, we think we should open source this. We're going to go to legal and have them start to look at it. And then, of course, 3 months down the line or however long down the line, somebody in the business says, well, wait a minute, why are we open sourcing that? And legal's gone and done this work. So now we have that discussion ahead of time, right? It's the very first stage in our process, what we call the business and strategy review. And we engage the business leaders, we engage the engineering teams, and we say, okay, it's great that you want to open source this. Tell us why. What is the strategic value for Autodesk in open sourcing this? Potentially, what do we lose in terms of ability to patent things? All the things that businesses think about, we just are very intentional about that conversation now.
When you do talk about this process, and you have open source a lot of project, and you're also consuming a lot of open source project. So when your developer, an Autodesk developer, he looks at a GitHub repository, whether it's pushing the code or consuming the code, and you also mentioned legal. So what kind of process is there so that the developer doesn't have to worry about, reaching out to the lawyer, hey, I'm using this code, can I use it or not?
Right, so we actually have done a couple of things. There were multiple different ways that you got approval, before I started the company, there were multiple different ways that you got approval to contribute something to upstream open source or consume something from open source or create your own open source project. And I sat down with the chief legal counsel, our open source legal counsel that I mentioned, and we set about fixing this from a process standpoint. So now we have a single process for how you get approval to contribute upstream or how you get approval to open source some code that we have internally. We're still kind of working on what the consumption looks like, and we're kind of in the middle of that now. One of the things that legal has done to ease consumption is basically come up with a license whitelist, which says, if the component that you want to bring in and consume is using one of these pre-approved licenses, okay, you're good, right? And that way legal only gets involved in kind of those edge cases now, which is a huge benefit. It lets developers and engineering managers say, hey, I want to go use this open source component. oh, okay, it's licensed under one of these licenses that legal is already happy with, we're golden. We don't have to worry about it. Now, they still have to track it, right? We do have to track it from a compliance standpoint, but it eases the burden where those teams don't feel like, okay, we've got to go through legal for every single thing. But it gives us the oversight for, licenses that legal isn't as comfortable with. The other thing that we've done is basically when you get approval to contribute upstream, what we said is per each team and each upstream project, we want you to go through the process the first time if it's a bug fix or small enhancement, because we have 3 categories: bug fix, small enhancement, and large enhancement. And we're pretty trusting of our developer organization to say, we're going to trust you to tell us what's a major enhancement versus a small or a bug fix. Once they've gone through the process, the approval process for an upstream project for a small enhancement or a bug fix, they don't have to come back to us again. They just continue to, as long as they're only contributing small or enhancements or bug fixes, we're just like, okay, you guys know the process, you've essentially registered with us, make those contributions. Now, if you're going to do a major contribution, we do ask that you come back through because we want to run an IP review cycle with legal. And generally, we found that to be pretty beneficial because it strikes a balance that legal wants the oversight, right? In a perfect world, they want complete oversight, but it strikes a balance of having oversight with legal, but freedom for the developer teams to your point, to not feel like, oh gosh, it's such a burden to go use this piece of code.
And for the large pieces, how complicated, how long does it take for a developer to actually get the approval? Depends on that.
Right now it kind of depends. The business and strategy review is usually pretty quick. I run that right now, so I
fine. Go ahead.
That's well, gosh, I'm not that liberal. I am better about like making sure that we're doing the right thing, but I think it can take anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, depends on how complex the license is. It depends on whether there's potential patentable things within the code for us. And so, I think we strive with the legal team, and I've been working really hard with them to get their SLA down. And I think they're doing a great job, right? It's not perfect, and it's always going to be the long pole in the tent. Legal approval will always be the long pole in the tent. And I think it's one of the reasons why, especially on the consumption side, that the legal team has said, we're going to do this whitelist of licenses, and I totally applauded that. I was super supportive of that because it does ease the burden, especially on the consumption side. Because remember, most companies are going to consume way more than they're going to contribute.
And that's why I said the word consumer.
Yeah.
So what are the licenses which are like whitelisted, and which are the ones which are like still like untouchable?
Boy, I can't remember as many of the ones that are on not the whitelist, but on the whitelisted side, I think you've got things like Apache, MIT, BSD. Yeah, I think GPL is not on the whitelisted one. I'm pretty sure it's not.
I'm sure GPL v3 will never be there. Right?
I always say I am not a lawyer, so this is my I am not a lawyer, right? So my legal team, when they see this, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't give legal advice here, but yeah, I think they made an assessment, and what I like is that they made an assessment and put together a whitelist. And it's reasonable, right?
GPLs can be tricky, AGPL, Afro, that covers everything. The moment it touches it,
And the Affero thing is obviously a trigger, and it's one of the things. So, and especially as we move towards more cloud offerings with Autodesk, obviously Affero is a concern, and our legal team needs to look at that.
Right. And you also talked about compliance, with even if you're using open source, that doesn't mean you have to, even if you're MIT, because you're mixing a lot of lines. So how do you ensure that, you are in compliant, you're not violating any of that? So
we have a project that we're in the process of implementing now that we call Project Aegis, which is a joint venture internally between our security organization, our legal organization, and kind of the open source program office. And the goal behind that is not just the scanning solution, because everybody does a scanning solution, right? It's not just the scanning solution, but it's how we do workflow. From when you bring an open source or third-party component in, making sure the version is within an acceptable window, making sure that there's been security scans done so there's no open CVE vulnerabilities, and then all the way to, okay, how do you sunset that version of the open source component or third-party component and get to the next version. So I think right now it's basically, it's the thing we're working on most actively now is really building in the full process. And we have the process definition. We're rolling teams through it. And then on the back end, there's also all of the scanning to make that happen. But again, I always say to people, it's less about the tool. And this is something we talk about a lot inside Autodesk right now is you don't just want to buy a tool. You can't just buy a tool and have that tool be, okay, I bought the tool and it fixes this, right? customers come to us, and it's not just Autodesk, every place I've always been, customers come to you, and they're not asking you necessarily what scanning tool you're running. They want to know what your process is and how you're effectively making sure that when you bring something in and then you build your code with that and you build your product with that and give it to them, that you're in compliance. Because I look at it this way, it's a supply chain trust, right? We consume from open source and other third parties as a supply chain. We are one link in a supply chain for our customers that are using our products to build things. And so you have to have that full level of trust. And it takes effort, and it takes really diligence, and I think it's one of the things that I'm most proud of the fact that we're working on now. We're not perfect, we're not there yet, but I think it's going really well from an evolutionary standpoint.
Let's move away from technology, let's move away from the process, and let's talk about people.
Sure.
That's what open source is.
Yeah.
How do you actually encourage people within Autodesk so that they become active contributors, to the open source community?
Well, it's kind of funny. I mean, as a community person, as a community guy, right? I mean, my boss will tell you that I'm much more about community than I am about process, even though it's important. I'm very fortunate. I mean, I work in a part of Autodesk called Engineering Platform, whose actual charter is improving best practices and culture in the company, and engineering culture in the company. So I do a lot of talks. We have a lot of conversations around with development teams around why this stuff is important. We have this mantra of default to open internally, for sure. I talk about that a lot. It was something that came up sort of accidentally in a meeting that I was in, because you probably know, you've read that we brought Slack into the company, even though it's not an open source tool. I always say that ahead of time. But it was kind of self-selected by our community. But what Slack has done is, using the tool has allowed us to have a transparency across the company, which we haven't had prior to implementing that. And so that notion of we're defaulting to open, things don't have to be private, that is part and parcel with getting people to understand that contributing to open source is valuable, consuming from open source is valuable. So when I talk about people, and culture, I don't always couch it in how we're necessarily working to be more effective in open source, even though I think it's a byproduct of that. I'm actually trying to open up the company internally, right? And so when we have something like Slack, where we've got everyone on the company that is sort of self-selected, and they're now in this transparent mode where, we say, we don't allow private channels by default. We have cases where people come through review process and for finance and other sensitive discussions, we create a private channel, but we're kind of changing the mindset of teams to say, we don't need to have a private channel now, right? For our team's development status channel does not need to be private. Now, it's a culture change, right? It's a change in environment for teams that traditionally are not used to doing that. And so I think a lot of it is giving them the avenue to do that. One of the things my boss talks a lot about is creating what we call psychological safety, right? Modeling that in our team to say, you know what, it's okay for you to talk about things inside the company that maybe you failed at. What did you learn? Embracing failure, creating that psychological safety so that people feel like, okay, we can actually do this. And that actually leads to kind of this natural outgrowth of, okay, well, this is sort of the way the open source world works. And I think that's what I focus on a lot. I always say I have 3 jobs at Autodesk. One job around open source and open source strategy, one job around inner source, so using all the open source development methodologies to be more effective within our organization as we build product, and then a culture change piece. And honestly, the culture change piece, while kind of hard to define sometimes and nebulous, is the most important piece of my role, I feel, because if I don't start to change the culture and get a more default to open methodology in the company and a way of being, anything I do in open source strategy or inner source strategy is going to be really, really difficult to implement.
When you do mention inner source, at times I have seen with companies that even the engineers, there are 2 different units, or they're actually competing with each other. They're duplicating the work. Yeah. So how do you ensure that is not happening at Autodesk?
Sometimes I can't. Sometimes that does happen. I think one of the ways, we kind of approach it 2 ways. One is transparency, right? So again, having a system, ours happens to be Slack, it could have been IRC, it could have been whatever. Having a place where there is discoverability, where teams can start to poke around and go, oh, hey, wait a minute, this other team is doing that, right? So having that place to have transparency, changing the mindset where we always ask, it's the whole build buy thing. Right? And so we say, can you go buy from another team? And I use buy in quotes, but how can you go find from another team something that's already been done instead of building it yourself? And that's just a change in culture and a change in mindset. And I think we're starting to see that, because what we're hopefully starting to do, and this is kind of rolling out in some of the way we're trying to measure people from an HR and a metric standpoint, is, how much have you collaborated with other teams? How much code have you written versus reused? Right, so there's some things we can gather because we use GitHub Enterprise internally. So we have some metrics that we're working on gathering around, how many contributions are coming from, especially in certain projects, how many contributions are coming from external, meaning all within our firewall, but external to that project, right? How many contributions are you getting from another part of the organization, and then rewarding that. So to answer your question, there's no certain way that I can say, okay, we're not duplicating work. Right, and this is not unique to Autodesk. Pretty much any company I've ever been in, there's always a little bit of duplication of work. It's being transparent so that we can give people an opportunity to not duplicate that work, rewarding them for not duplicating that, and specifically rewarding them for actually having collaborations with other parts of the organization.
I think the first step is first of all, to make them aware that there is something similar going on before they can decide.
Discovery is a huge piece, right?
Yes.
And I know this is one of the things that we talk about all the time, is obviously search is one avenue for that in GitHub Enterprise, but we've done things like had a crowdsourced list, what we call the Awesome Autodesk repository. That's basically this crowdsourced thing where people can say, oh, hey, I found this, and oh, did you know this team's doing this? And we basically keep a list. It's literally like a readme.md that's got this categorized list of things that people have found as that they consider inner source. And people make a pull request against that list, we merge it, and basically you've now got sort of what the community inside the company thinks is important from an inner source standpoint. So that's one avenue that we try to take with discoverability. We've thought about but haven't really implemented yet, kind of the gamification notion of, hey, is your project inner source? You get an inner source badge. Now, we haven't implemented that yet. That's one of the things we've thought about to kind of see, does gamification help in this case? I don't know. There's really no perfect answer, but discoverability, like you said, is absolutely huge. But it's not just the discoverability and the sort of the tools piece. It's it's sort of how you figure out how you motivate people.
So you are here at the Open Source Leadership Summit. So what have you been doing here?
Well, I did a presentation called Culture First, Process Second, Tools Last, the open source way of collaborative tool choice, and it was talking a lot about the instances of good sort of tool rollout versus challenging tool rollout, and I used Slack within Autodesk as one of the examples of a good tool rollout. And I really wanted to focus in that presentation on getting people to understand, and I'm guilty of this as still somebody who has an engineering background, of always going to, hey, if I can build a tool for that, or I can buy a tool for that to solve a problem, without considering the human piece, the culture piece, what the existing process looks like, how you potentially need to change that before you bring a tool on to actually support that. I've just seen too many instances of companies choosing tools for reasons other than the most important, which is, are their users going to be effective at using it, right? And so as a community person, I love the notion of, I talked about in my talk, the notion that shadow IT isn't always a bad thing. Shadow IT can sometimes be looked at, in my opinion, as an early warning system for the fact that users went off and chose something that they thought was valuable. And that's really how Slack happened in our company. At 85 different instances of Slack, when I went and looked around, and getting people all on board on a single instance, I was able to capture momentum that was already there. But if I had said, well, I'm going to go choose IRC because I'm an open source guy and I think that's important, and I got a third of the company on IRC and really nobody else using it, that's not a win, right? It's a win from a purist standpoint, but it's not a win from a pragmatic standpoint. And so I gave that talk here at Open Source Leadership Summit. Obviously, I'm also here to interface with all of my colleagues. I joke, and it's actually probably not a joke, that in terms of open source program office people, there's probably 40 or so of us in the world, and we all know each other. And so when we're at these conferences, I think we get to share a lot of best practices. We get to hear in more detail what other teams are doing, and then kind of pull from that and use that knowledge to improve our own open source program offices.
Yeah, I mean, I've been covering open source for so long, and what happens is all these people, they just keep moving from one company to other company,
Yeah.
but the same set of people is like a tribe.
It's the same set of people. Yeah. It was kind of funny.
It's also good because you're kind of spreading that culture throughout the whole it doesn't really matter which company you're working for.
Right.
As you move from one company, you learn something new, and then that's what open source is all about.
Right. I mean, that's the reason I think I made the kind of switch in my career from writing code for a living to now getting to write code for fun, but actually in my living, making a living dealing with people in open source, and I think getting companies to sort of understand where the value is, right? We all talk about open source as one from the perspective of every company sort of has to use it. I still think there's a huge amount of improvement that can happen in companies to really, really understand how you marry the proprietary world with the open source world, and do it in a way that you're not usurping the rights or the passions of that community. It's actually interesting you bring this up, because I think a lot of people get wrapped around, I see two kind of camps in open source, right? There's what I would consider far left, ultra pure, everything must be open source, and I applaud those people. And I've had a laptop, I've had a laptop where I've gotten Linux to run, and I totally have total respect for that. I think we need that. Those people push the edge of the envelope. And of course you have the far right of everybody who's totally proprietary. The reality is, most of us do most of our work in the middle. And I call myself an open source pragmatist because I think most of the time I do stuff in the middle, right? I run a MacBook, but I run a ton of open source software on that MacBook. Exactly, yeah. And I think it's important I think most of the work gets done in the middle, and those of us I think that are effective in these open source program office roles bring a marriage of practicality for companies that build proprietary software for a reason, but utilize open source software to do that.
I mean, I also do the same, and the whole reason for me, the tool is more important, and most of the time that tool happens to be open source.
Right.
And there are some times when it's not, it doesn't matter, it has to be the right tool. Right. Anyway, thanks a lot for taking time out and talking to me today. It was really great talking to you after such a long time.